Psychologists often use a three-stage model in characterizing human memory. The three stages are sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Sensory memory involves a very brief storage of information gathered from the environment. Short-term memory is characterized by whatever you are currently thinking about. Short-term memory acts as an interface between sensory memory and long-term memory. So if you are asked to recall the capital of Canada or remember where you were when you had your first kiss, you are getting information from long-term memory and bringing it into short-term memory. Also, if you just learned a fact and you're trying to remember it in the long term, say days or weeks from now, you use short-term memory to try and make that information available in long-term memory so you could use it in some manner in the future. Long-term memory is thought to be analogous to a warehouse where you store information for very long periods of time and hopefully retrieve it for when you need it. For each stage of memory, we can examine the capacity and duration. The capacity refers to how many items can be held in memory, and the duration refers to how long that information can be maintained by that memory system. This video will focus on sensory memory, and in particular, iconic storage. Iconic storage is your capacity or your ability to retain visual information from the environment. You could loosely think of it as if you were to shut your eyes, how long does that afterimage stay as a picture in your mind? In 1960, George Sperling did a study to examine the capacity and duration of iconic storage. During this video, we will now replicate or present to you Sperling's methodology. The experiment began with the presentation of a fixation point. A fixation point is simply a cross or a marker presented on the screen to notify participants where to look. The fixation point was replaced by a very brief display of an array of letters. There were 3 rows, each containing 4 separate letters. Sperling had 2 separate report conditions. The first, called the whole report condition. In the whole report condition, participants were required to write down as many letters as they could from the entire array. So let's try this now. In a moment, you will see a fixation point followed by a very brief display of letters. Try and write down as many letters as you can as soon as the display disappears. Ready? Begin. See, I told you it would be brief. Okay, now we're going to try that again. Ready? Okay, here's one last trial. The results from the whole report condition suggest that participants can remember on average 4 or 5 items from the visual display. This led researchers to believe that the capacity of iconic memory is only 4 or 5 items. However, Sperling came up with an ingenious modification to the task. He developed what he termed the partial report condition. In the partial report condition, instead of trying to report the entire array, participants only have to report as many items as they can from a single line of the array. How Sperling achieved this is he presented participants with either a high-pitched, medium-pitched, or low-pitched tone to indicate to the participants which line they would have to report. Thus, if they got the high-pitched tone, they would only have to report the top line of the array, the medium-pitched tone for the medium array, and the low-pitched tone for the bottom line of the array. The brilliant thing he did in the study was he presented the tone after the array disappeared. That way, participants had to rely on their iconic memory to generate the report, as opposed to just focusing their attention on a single line of the array. Notice if he presented the tone before the array appeared, then participants would simply look at that line and ignore the other two lines. By presenting it afterwards, participants had to focus their attention on the entire array, and then only after it disappeared, rely on the iconic memory to report cued information or the required information. So, let's try the partial report condition. You'll again be given a fixation point and an array, but this time either high, medium, or low pitched tone will sound after the array disappears, and then your task is to report as many letters as you can from that line and only that line that the tone corresponds to. Ready? Here we go. Now let's do a second and finally a third trial. What Sperling found is that people in the partial report condition can report on average about 3.3 items, so somewhere between 3 and 4 items. But notice if they can report on average 3.3 items from any given row, that means that the capacity is probably closer to 10 items given that we have 3 rows, or 3 times 3.3. Sperling's experiment allowed us to understand that the capacity of iconic memory is much larger than we initially thought it was, 10 items versus simply 4 or 5. Furthermore, the duration of iconic memory is thought to be rather brief, less than a second.